Hello guys, and today's video is going to be about the potential for adding a new nation to War Thunder, the Panslavic tree. This is an idea that I had that I kind of stole from World of Warships, which is the game I used to play a lot before I moved over to War Thunder. They have, for example, a Pan-American tree, which gathers all of the nations in South America together because no one nation has enough ships for a whole line on their own. And considering that the majority of War Thunder nations at this point either will have or do have a sub-tree, for example Finland in the Swedish tree, I thought why not just make a composite tree from the outset? Lots of people have suggested Poland, Yugoslavia or other European nations as new trees, but honestly I don't think any one of them has enough ground vehicles to make a full tree. But all of the Slavic nations combined definitely do. The nations would include Poland and Bulgaria, then Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, as well as their modern successor states. Obviously, Russia is already considered the successor state to the Soviet Union in-game. Their vehicles come after Soviet vehicles, so they wouldn't really be included because their vehicles already go in the Soviet tree. The big question mark would be Belarus and Ukraine. They were republics of the Soviet Union itself, so it makes sense for their vehicles to go in the Soviet tree. Although I don't see that as being a popular choice with Ukrainians and Belarusians. So don't forget to smash that like and subscribe, and we'll get into some vehicles for this new tree that personally I find interesting. First up we have what is a pretty safe choice in my opinion, and that is the PZA Loara, which is going to be represented by the Gepard in the footage. You can think of it as a Gepard with a T-72 hull for the purposes of gameplay. In reality, this is a PT-91 hull, which is essentially a heavily modernized T-72 M1 that sort of blurs the line between new tank and upgrade package. Most of this isn't like super relevant for the gameplay of the Loara, but it does feature a completely new Polish engine and transmission. And while the tank is heavier, so the engine power doesn't necessarily translate into better performance straight like one-to-one, it can actually reverse. It has a reverse gear, it can go up to 20 kilometers an hour in reverse. And anyone who's played the T-72 will know how much of an upgrade that actually is. The original prototype for the Loara was built on a Polish T-72 chassis as the project began while the PT-91 Tawady was still in development. In the end, a few different prototypes were constructed, as well as one series production tank that was produced. It could fire APDS, much like the Gepard can in the footage I'm playing in the background, so it's likely it would play very similarly to the German Gepard. The Loara also had access to ahead rounds, just like the ones found on the Puma, but honestly so does the Gepard, but the Gepard also doesn't have them in-game yet. I'm not sure if Gaijin just haven't gotten around to adding them, or whether it's for balance reasons, but honestly, ahead is pretty meh anyway. In the end, the Loara never actually entered service officially, but the Polish military did operate the one production example until 2013 when it was retired. And considering basically every nation has its own version of the Gepard at this point, it makes sense for our new Panslavic tree to get one as well. Next up, we have the Scott 2AM, represented by the Ratel 20. This was a Czechoslovak-Polish joint project initiated by Czechoslovakia in the 1950s to replace the German half-tracks they were still using at the time. Now, this project had many setbacks. Firstly, they wanted parts commonality with the army's truck that was in development. Well, development and production beginning overlaps with the start of this story, but they wanted parts commonality with the Praga V3S, which caused problems not only for the OT-64 project, as it was known by the Czechoslovaks, but also it even caused problems with production of the Praga V3S itself. And really, multiple groups of people were pulling this project in different directions. The army wanted a high-standard, modern vehicle. The Czechoslovak Politburo wanted to import Soviet designs because it was cheaper. And the industry representatives, they just wanted to get their nuts out of the fire, honestly, with the huge scale of industrial production that was going on in a still recovering and rebuilding Czechoslovakia. You have to remember, the war had only ended 5 or 6 years ago when this project was initiated, and the communist coup d'etat was only 3 years ago. So the state was in a very not ideal position for huge industrial production. And bear in mind, this was just one of 3 APC designs that they had at the time, not including the Soviet BTR 152, which was also competing. Fun fact, one of these designs eventually turned into a copy of the German Sonderkraftfahrzeug 251 half-track, and this copy was so bad, the troops nicknamed it Mustache Man's Revenge. It also didn't help when the Soviets waded in, pun intended, and heavily suggested that the vehicle should also be amphibious. By this point in the late 1950s, quite a few years have gone by, Poland also became heavily involved in the project, as during that period they were also looking for an APC. Eventually it ended up that most of the internals, for example the engine, was made in what is now Czechia, with the hulls being made in Poland, along with final assembly being in the Polish city of Lublin. Later, the second variant of the OT-64 would feature a BRDM-2 turret, and small numbers of them would be fitted with the Malutka ATGM. The closest analogue we have in game is the Ratel, but obviously it would have a manually guided ATGM, and a smaller 14.5mm gun. Although, this is by far the most successful vehicle on this list, which you might not assume given its somewhat rocky development story. But overall, nearly 4,500 of these things were built, including all variants, with around a third of them being exported to other countries. It would come to be operated by around 20 different countries, with countries including India, Uruguay, and Algeria still operating fleets of over 100 of them to this day. Next up, we have some very interesting vehicles from Bulgaria. We have the Panzer IV with the ZIS-3 cannon, and I'm going to let you know straight away that these tanks never actually ran, from what I can tell. It looks like nobody can really agree on the dates, but the gist of the story is that Bulgaria kind of felt a need to construct defensive lines on its southern border, which is with Turkey, a NATO member. They looked at their aging out armor and decided that burying a bunch of it in the ground to essentially be in a permanent hold down position, or a fancy pillbox, was a good idea. Now, it looks like they just grabbed whatever outdated equipment they had and in some cases mashed it together to make something viable. As to exactly when this happened, sources appear to disagree. Some people say the first line was constructed primarily with German equipment sometime after the Second World War, and then later a second line was constructed, primarily based on the T-34 chassis in 1974. This is the version that most seem to agree on, but I've seen a few saying that this happened as late as the 1980s. The line of defences that was constructed was then abandoned sometime in the early 1990s as it was seen as surplus to requirement. Because these tanks were constructed with the explicit purpose of being static defences, most sources that go as far as to talk about the internals say that the transmission, engine, and other parts needed to, move were removed to make place for more ammunition. Apparently, the Bulgarians were optimistic that these things wouldn't be immediately annihilated in the case of the Cold War going hot. I can tell you though, I sure as anything would not want to be inside what is essentially a glorified metal coffin. Although, if there are any Bulgarians watching and they know more about the history of these things, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. In-game though, the Panzer IV with the ZIS-3 cannon would fit in pretty well around 4.0 with the other T-34s and Panzer IVs. I say T-34 specifically because the ZIS-3 actually has the same 76.2mm caliber as the T-34. In fact, a modified version of the F-34 cannon, the ZIS-5, which armed some KV-1 variants, was actually produced at the same factory, Artillery Factory number 92, or its more popular name, Zavod imeni Stalina, which is where the abbreviation ZIS comes from, the Stalin Factory. It actually still exists and produces artillery to this day. It's now known as the Nizhny Novgorod Machine Building Factory though. And the next item on our list is also Bulgarian, the BMP-23 represented by the 2S1. And I really hope you appreciate the gameplay, because getting anything even resembling decent gameplay with the stock 2S1 was not a fun experience. Anyway, the BMP-23. In the late 1970s, Bulgaria was still operating imported Soviet BMP-1s. While the vehicle was generally liked by the Bulgarians, it was starting to get a bit long in the tooth by the time our story starts. From what I understand, there were three main goals with the project. Firstly, they wanted something with a little bit more armor than the BMP-1 because they felt the protection was no longer adequate, which I can definitely agree with. Secondly, they wanted more space, as the infantry carrying compartment of really all Soviet BMP models are notoriously cramped, which again, I can definitely agree with, having seen the inside of a BMP. And thirdly, they wanted something that could be produced domestically in Bulgaria. And as the 2S1 was already under licensed production at the time, they decided to use that as the basis for the new vehicle, the BMP-23. The 2S1 itself was a conversion of the MTLB, which was designed primarily as a personnel carrier. It's not as weird as it might seem to convert an SPG into an APC, or, well, in this case, an infantry fighting vehicle. The vehicle was then armed with the ZU-23, giving it the name BMP-23, which is actually the same cannon found on the BTR-ZD or the Shilka, just with one barrel and the ability to select a lower fire rate. Usually infantry fighting vehicles have down-rated cannons. They don't need that massive fire rate to hit a, moving plane while they're only firing at infantry. Then, later, some of the BMP-23s were also upgraded to carry manual and then later semi-active ATGMs, much like those found on the BMP-1. It also had an improved engine over the 2S1, allowing it to reach speeds of up to 62 kilometers an hour or 39 miles per hour, making this quite the snappy little boy as well. Some sources disagree on the number, but between 50 and 114 of these things were built by Kintex during the 1980s into the very early 1990s. And it's still in service with its sole operator, the Bulgarian army, to this day. Then lastly, we have the M60PB, represented by the most recent Battle Pass vehicle, the WZ-141-1. And the M60PB is actually shockingly similar in its characteristics. The footage you're watching, this is probably like the closest to the actual vehicle in terms of the War Thunder vehicle I'm showing. This project was initiated in the mid-1950s because it was understood at the time that any armored breakthrough needed infantry support, and the Yugoslavs just didn't have any APCs at the time. Well, other than a very small number of captured German half-tracks that were being used mainly for training, and they were actually using trucks instead because, yeah, they just didn't have any APCs. The project was based heavily on the American M59 APC. And I'm showing it now, and you'd be forgiven for thinking it's an M113 because they look incredibly similar. The reason for that being is that the M113 was actually an upgraded M59, basically. While the design was heavily influenced by the Americans, the construction was distinctly Soviet. I mean, they just used what they had as the basis, and that was the Su-76. This was a disaster. The original base M60 variants were plagued with issues from transmission breakdowns to engines overheating. The modernized M60P did go some way to addressing these concerns in the 1970s, with all M60s being upgraded to this standard, but the vehicle would go on to have serious reliability issues for its entire service life. This, though, did not stop the Yugoslavs and later former Yugoslav nations from adapting these vehicles to a wide variety of purposes, much like the M59 and later 113 actually. And one of these many uses included strapping a pair of recoilless rifles to the roof for anti-tank work. And while this conversion wasn't done until the 1970s, interestingly, recoilless rifles of various calibers were actually suggested to be part of the project right from its inception in the 1950s, although they were cut. And despite its cursed nature, the M60 was, over the course of a few decades, produced in large numbers, with around 800 total examples being churned out by the Yugoslavians, nearly 200 of which would be exported to its only other non-Yugoslav operator, Iraq. And it seems like Iraq kind of got the short end of the stick there because, well, all of the issues I mentioned with operating the things. And all in all, considering how similar this vehicle is to the WZ-141, at least in appearance and characteristics, it wouldn't surprise me if this thing also ended up around 6.7 BR, just the same as the WZ-141. So that was my list of interesting Panslavic vehicles. I tried to pick a few from a few different nations. So hopefully you found this interesting. Thank you for coming, guys. Don't forget to smash that like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.